Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 285. Episode 285. It's good to be with you and to get to share our time together continuing through 1 Corinthians. As those of you who've been here for a while know, when we hit a multiple of 15, which 285 is, we like to stop and take a second to remind ourselves who we are and what we're about. Here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea, we believe the Word of God is powerful, that God has spoken His Word into the world and given us His Word for the purposes of changing it for the glory of Christ. And so because of a belief in that power, we want to just sit down and absorb it and go slowly. And so in trying to live out our faith in that and a diligence in the Word of God, we take a text, and we take a few verses, and we go slowly through a book, step by step by step by step, letting us uncover what God has for us in that. And there's many times that there's places that I've skipped over before, and some of the richest things I've done and the most blessed situations or places where I've gotten to look at stuff that I wouldn't normally have looked at. And so in trust in God, we do that. So we take a few verses, take about 15 minutes, usually about 3 or 4 verses it's been recently, and find the big idea. What's the main thing? We're not interested necessarily in the stuff that's tangential or peripheral or somewhat foolish questions. We want to just settle in on what's the main thing. What's the big thing that's happening here, the thing that overrides and explains the rest of the context. In order to do that, find some supporting ideas. Always find 3 of those. You could find more. Sometimes it doesn't quite fit right, but we got to try to keep that uniform in some way, so that we can see how all this tie together, and hopefully you're able to see that big idea and the supporting ideas all coming together into one unit, and that stacks together. We give you summary, give you some application questions because you need to apply this in order to see its power. So that's who we are. That's what we do. We've been at this for 5 years now, and as far as I'm concerned, no end in sight. Looking forward to continuing that journey, and so thankful for everyone and your support in being with us through that. Coming up on episode 300, which is pretty crazy, and we're just so excited for the ride. As mentioned, we want to put this into practice, and one thing that's really important when it comes to putting things into practice is to make sure we do this in community. That when it comes out to how do we live that out, how do we apply that, how do we make sure that we're obedient to this, is to have other people. And so normally it's just me, and I'm me on the microphone, and I go. But at the end of every book, we have a question and response episode. We don't claim for it to be a question and answer episode, but question and response. Respond to the questions you send. You can check the show notes below for the email. Also, you can comment below questions that you see. That really helps us out because we want to dig into what you guys want to see and respond and go back and forth, and let this not just be some crazy dude in his office who's just talking all the time, but that we engage with this together as the people of God, in the wisdom of God for the glory of God. And I'll say today, there's some sticky stuff that we're just not going to have time to pull it all apart between this last episode and this episode, so that's super important. So I appreciate your patience in that, kind of who we are, where we're going. So if you have questions, especially after today, be a great day. I think there's a lot of questions that are just kind of low-hanging fruit. What about? Drop those in the comments, send us an email, and looking forward to that. So thanks for your patience. Of course, on an episode like this with that much intro, we'll probably go a little long, but bear with us in that. Want to honor your time, and we'll dive into 1 Corinthians 10, verse 27 to 30. If an unbeliever invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without making questions for the sake of conscience. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. Now, by conscience, I do not mean your own, but the other person's. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered about that for which I gave thanks? We're continuing this section, which is the final stages of the food in idols temple section, also known as the food offered to idols section. To this point, Paul started by showing that partaking of food offered to an idol in an idol's temple is unacceptable. It's unacceptable because it draws people into sin. Paul then took his excursus to demonstrate the lengths he's willing to go to in order for people to know Christ and the trouble that the Corinthians would have been in if he had the same attitude that he had towards them. More recently, Paul has argued that regardless of if there are weak Christians around to witness it or not, you shouldn't partake of this. It's categorically wrong because it's partnering with the demonic forces behind the idolatrous institution as a whole. Paul wants the Corinthians to see that even if the idols are nothing, there are spiritual forces behind the scenes of idolatry. And for them to go and partake of the food in those places means they're in fellowship with those demons and the idolatrous system as a whole, thus provoking the Lord to jealousy. Now, some Corinthians might have argued that the idol is nothing, and so there's no significance. I'm not attaching myself to anything if I go into that temple. But Paul's saying that partaking of food is participation. If there's an event going on and you do things that people are doing at that event, with the people at the event, then you are a participant. You are a participant. As such, going to eat the food in that place is participation with the demonic forces behind it. Last time, Paul encouraged us to seek the good of what edifies others instead of our own personal enjoyment. Today's big idea is respect of conscience is essential. Respect of conscience is essential. Our first idea is going to be eat what's before you. Number 2, don't knowingly eat idol foods. Number 3, partake with thanksgiving. So eat what's before you. Don't knowingly eat idol foods, and partake with thanksgiving. Eat knowingly and partake. So Paul begins with some explicit technical instructions about how to engage with the reality of idolatry in the world and the intersection of Christian lives. You know, it's nice to say all this stuff in the abstract, but sometimes it just gets a little messier. So how do you deal with the next bit of what about? So if you'll recall, last time we finished up by reading his statement that if you find food in the marketplace, go ahead and buy it. Don't ask questions for the sake of conscience, which he'll unpack what that means today. Paul wants them to realize that just like there's no spiritual difference between the wood in the idol and the wood in the fire, a la Isaiah, there's no difference between the food that came from the farm to the market and the food that came from, the farm to the idol's temple to the market, because all those temples and everything in the world belongs to God. The meat is not permanently tainted by idolatry. The issue with the food offered to idols in the idol's temple is just that. It's the temple. It's the location. And so similarly, because the food is not a problem, Paul says if an unbeliever invites you to eat with them, go and eat what they put in front of you. Now, if it's an unbeliever, there's a good statistical chance they're not trying to avoid food offered to idols in any sense at all. There's a good chance it might be that. And so because all food belongs to God, though, you can go and eat that. And you may look down at your plate and you're like, this was probably offered to an idol. Okay, that's fine. It belongs to God above and beyond the idol's ownership of that thing. The fact that it might come from an idol's temple to the marketplace is not a problem because, like we say, it doesn't belong to the idol. The fact that it's been offered to him doesn't make it, it doesn't give him ownership of that thing at all. It ultimately belongs to God. So in terms of being all things to all people from the previous chapter, we do have the freedom to interact with non-believers on these terms. But to be clear, we want to be really clear here. This isn't a case of doing a wrong thing in order to win somebody to Christ. This isn't a case of doing a wrong thing in order to win someone to Christ. Paul is saying there's nothing wrong about it. There's nothing about it that is wrong. And again, Paul frees them from the burden of trying to ascertain the origin of this meat and tells them not to ask questions because of conscience. We might ask, what does that mean? That brings us to our next point, and one that I'm going to struggle to keep succinct as we've talked about because this gets into a lot of things, and we'll just bear with me. We'll try to do our best. He's previously said not to ask questions, both in the marketplace and at dinner, and both times it's for the sake of conscience. And I want to quickly say one thing here. The issue of food in 1 Corinthians and the issue of conscience in 1 Corinthians is analogous and related to the questions in the end of Romans 14, but they're different. Okay, and I don't have time to try to do a full dive in there, but I've done enough reading and checking on this that they're different. So don't assume that this is the Romans deal, and don't assume the Romans deal is this. It's a little bit different. We need to read it carefully and kind of shut our brain off about the other one and then come back to this one. Okay, so just want to keep that in mind here. Don't assume they're the same. Read them carefully and diligently because it's different settings. Okay, he does say plainly that if we find out that the food that's in front of us, somebody puts a meal in front of us and says, oh yeah, that was offered to an idol, then the Christian is under an obligation not to eat it. So we can go and we can look at it and say, odds on this was offered to an idol. We can eat it. But if they say it was offered to an idol, then we should not eat it. Now, this obviously applies to the dinner party setting because, the reason of conscience is given in both cases. But I think it's more likely than not that it kind of applies across the board to the meat market as well. So what is the reason? Let's read this carefully. What's the reason that a Christian should refuse to eat food that's been offered to an idol if they are alerted to that fact? Well, as he says clearly, and by implication, for the reason not ask questions, it's for conscience. And our first instinct is, well, your personal conscience, right? It's sort of this like, don't ask, don't tell sort of situation. But that's actually incorrect. That's incorrect. It's the conscience of the person hosting the party. It's the conscience of the person who told you. See, here's the thing. If it were wrong to eat the food, it would be wrong to eat the food. If it were wrong to eat food that had been offered to an idol, if that gave it some spiritual, plague or contagion, then it would just be wrong to eat it, and you'd be under the obligation to search it out. You'd be under that obligation to search it out. In this case, the setting is more that someone warns you because they perceive that it's wrong for you to eat such a food. It's wrong. They perceive it's wrong for you to eat such a food. You need to respect their conscience about the matter. So it's not your personal conscience. If it were wrong to eat it, then, pretending like you don't know is not a good reason. That doesn't answer anything. Instead, you can have a clear conscience because the food belongs to God, as we've talked about extensively. But for their understanding of Christianity or misunderstanding about that, you need to accommodate that. So if a person, unbeliever or Christian, warns you and says, hey, that over there, that was offered to an idol, and I know you're a Christian, you don't do that, so you'll want to avoid that. Then you need to honor that warning. You need to honor that warning. I mean, they're trying to do you a favor, because if you just plow through and say, whatever, then you give the impression that you're wishy-washy on ethics or you don't care. Don't get into a fight at the table. Just, be a part of the long game on this. And I don't mean it as a game in terms of we're playing things, but realize that like at that moment, the answer is, okay, hey, thank you. I appreciate you having respect for my conscience here, and I want to give you the understanding, the right impression of how Christians engage with this. So the question then of where the second half of verse 29 and 30 fits into the argument is a tricky one, because it seems like Paul is saying things that appear contradictory. I would submit that it's correct to read the back half of 29 and 30 kind of going back to verse 25 and the expansion of asking no questions there, and the earth's the fullness and the Lord's and all thereof, that sort of thing. That's more of a parenthetical discussion of an example that kind of deals with all this. Okay, so Paul has declared plainly that to insist that food is tainted by idolatry, that it carries a demonic residue with it outside the temple, that's superstitious. That's not grounded in truth. If a person thinks, for the food that is recognized by God as if a person gives thanks for this food, as he mentioned, and recognizes that God's the source, God's the provider, and God's the possessor of the food, then it is indeed holy. It's okay for that person to eat it. You can compare that to 1 Timothy chapter 4, where food is sanctified by the word of God and the giving of thanks. And, in that it means that Christ in his word, Christ has said a word that has declared it clean. I believe it's in Mark. And then our giving of thanks recognizes that truth that God is the provider. So if a person does this, then any food is allowable. And this is the Christian teaching. A person declaring that such food is wrong to eat, they're incorrect. That's not what the will of God is on the topic. They're teaching something that's contrary to Christian doctrine, so they have no leg to stand on. So Paul, in his rhetorical question, is saying that God's given that liberty, and their condemnation should be ignored. The choice to not inquire about the source of food honors God, because they can't condemn you for eating food offered to an idol because nobody knows if it's been offered to an idol or not, and they don't know. That said, refusing to eat the food that everyone knows has been offered to an idol exercises that liberty through love, because you choose to respect their conscience on what Christians should be doing. Remember, we need to, at least in the short term, be willing to honor their misunderstanding in order to keep them from sin, and ultimately to win them back to Christ. Back to chapter 8, the issue may be that if a weak Christian sees you eating that food, they may be emboldened to do something they think is wrong, and then thinking they're participating in idolatry, even though it's not actually been offered, or even though it's not in the temple grounds, right? So you can kind of read chapter 8, read that situation back on top of this one, and I think that kind of helps you see why this is a problem. So it's a lot to say. Like I said, it's going to be a great Q&R. But it's time to land the plane, and I kind of feel like, if I just kind of, bear with me here, I kind of feel like I've just kind of like torn all the pieces apart on like one of the most technical and difficult things here. And so I just pray your patience and bearing with me in all that, because I haven't had time to put it all back together. But if I can just kind of revert to the ethos of this podcast, as we started with, what's the main thing? What's the main thing? Let's forget about all the technical, little if this, if that, what about this, what about that? Let's just think about this. First, there is no supernatural residue that attaches itself to food offered to idols. All food is just as clean if a person recognizes that God is the source of it. That is, a person rightly acknowledges the food belongs to God. If they acknowledge that, they're right about it, and it certainly doesn't belong to an idol. It doesn't. Second, we need to respect the misunderstandings of others on this. If they, the believer or the unbeliever, holds that eating food offered to an idol is a commendation of idolatry, then we should not do it. In either case, it's because partaking of that food tacitly endorses idolatry and their continued participation in it. Third, the fact that people feel that way about idolatry doesn't make them right. The fact that people have this superstition about it doesn't mean they're correct. And the fact that we need to honor and be patient with that doesn't make them correct. They're still wrong, but we need to act in a way that respects that. And Paul's middle way is, not seeking out information. But if they get the information, then don't eat. This allows people to honor both God and people. To be clear, this is not feigning ignorance to do something wrong. This is not watching a movie and, I just won't look it up, and see what content's in there, and, maybe it'll happen. Oh, what happened there? It just had all the, this content that's not good came up. Oh, I didn't know. That's not what this is. This is not intentionally doing wrong and feigning ignorance. That's not what this is, okay? This is about respecting people there. As we try to wrap this up and try to understand this ignorance deal, essentially it's just to say, hey, if we don't know, we don't know. There's nothing wrong with it. But if we can honor their conscience, then we need to honor people's consciences on that. It's hard to press the exact details on this, and there's some subtlety that I'm a bit leery about pressing into and be careful with, and we don't have time for that. And I'll say there's a reason this is part of Christian maturity. There's a reason why this is part of what it means to be a mature Christian, is finding the exact course of action, something this tricky that honors God and edifies all and is genuine, is hard, but it's worth it. It's worth it, and it's not optional. The last thing I'll say is, when it comes to that, this takes community and it takes wisdom. So be hesitant to form these sort of arguments on this, especially on this ignorance clause and how that works, or extend what we've got here without the help of the community of Christ. Be hesitant to do that. If you got questions on this, like I say, send them over to the Q&R. I want to discuss this. I'm really excited to. I might even dream up some fake questions, to discuss on this, because I think it's so helpful and so interesting and helps us understand who we need to be. So let's ask some actual questions here and get us out of here. Do you seek to honor God? Do you want to obey Him in all things? When it comes to liberty and privileges, do you step into them because you want them, or because you're fully convinced in your own mind that it is acceptable? Do you work to support the potentially misguided understandings of people, or do you plow right through them and just ignore it? Are you doing the hard work of love for the good of others so that they might know Christ more deeply and honoring God together? Thanks so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes into Big Idea. Today's big idea: respect of conscience is essential.